The room was shrouded in the cold hum of monitors, their glow the only source of light in the otherwise dark space. Dr. Harper, the lead scientist of the project, sat motionless at the control panel, her eyes glued to the screen as she reviewed the incoming data. The team had been working for hours, poring over readings from deep within Area 51's Level 10, a place even the government had claimed to know little about. But tonight, something had changed. Something had triggered a series of events that no one had been prepared for. At first, it had been just another anomaly, another set of strange readings to be cataloged and forgotten. But then, as the data continued to come in, the pattern became clear. A highly unusual, undetectable entity had just escaped. And it wasn't just any anomaly. It was moving. Moving fast. Too fast. Dr. Harper's fingers hovered above the keyboard, her mind racing. The readings showed a strange fluctuation of energy, an energy field unlike anything known to man. At first, she thought it was a glitch, but as the data came in, she couldn't ignore the growing suspicion that something had escaped Level 10. Something powerful, something terrifying. Her heart rate quickened. She knew this was no longer just a theoretical exercise. This was real. "Do you see this?" Harper called out to her team, her voice steady but filled with growing urgency. One by one, the team members gathered around her desk, peering at the screen. Julia, the project's lead analyst, leaned over Dr. Harper's shoulder, her eyes narrowing as she studied the data. "This doesn't make sense," she whispered. "The energy readings, it's as if something is alive." Paul, the tech specialist, let out a low whistle as he glanced over the readings. "This isn't just a glitch. This is real. Something is escaping from Level 10. The realization hit them like a cold wave. Area 51 was known for its secrecy, its hidden projects that often crossed the boundaries of science and reason. But Level 10? It was something even the most senior officials barely acknowledged. What could be so dangerous, so powerful, that it had been hidden away for decades, and why was it now making its move? Dr. Harper's thoughts raced. She needed to act fast. She ordered her team to isolate the readings and trace the movement. But deep down, she knew that whatever was happening, it was already too late. Whatever was escaping had already crossed into the unknown, into the real world, into their world. A low beeping sound interrupted the silence. Dr. Harper's gaze snapped to the screen, her blood running cold. The entity, whatever it was, had moved. It was on the move, and the direction it was heading, straight toward the heart of the base. "Seal off the area," Dr. Harper ordered, her voice sharp. "Now." But as her team scrambled to follow her orders, the screen flickered once more, showing something they had all feared. A figure, a shadow, moving too fast to track. And in that moment, Dr. Harper knew that they were no longer just observers. They were involved in something much darker, much more dangerous. The truth was escaping, and it was terrifying. The tension in the control room was thick. The hum of the equipment, the soft click of keyboards, and the shuffling of papers were the only sounds that broke the silence. Dr. Harper stood at the front of the room, staring at the monitor displaying the anomaly's progress. She could feel the weight of the moment pressing down on her. Everything had changed. The situation was escalating and fast. "How did we miss this?" Julia asked, her voice trembling with disbelief. "I mean, this level of energy, it doesn't just show up out of nowhere." Dr. Harper shook her head, not entirely sure how to respond. It was true. Their team had worked with highly sensitive equipment before, but this energy, this anomaly, was unlike anything they had encountered. It wasn't just a power surge or some malfunction in the system. It was deliberate, almost intelligent, and it was moving, adapting, and shifting in ways they couldn't comprehend. "I don't know," Dr. Harper replied, her voice cold with fear. "But we've made a serious mistake by not recognizing it sooner." As the minutes passed, the entity's movements grew more erratic. The initial reading showed a consistent direction, but now it seemed as though the anomaly was shifting back and forth, almost as if it was exploring its surroundings or testing something. The very thought made Dr. Harper's blood run cold. "Look at this," Paul said, pointing to a secondary monitor. "It's like it's scanning the area. It's interacting with the environment." Dr. Harper's eyes widened as she saw what Paul was pointing to. The screen showed the energy pattern of the entity moving in tight, controlled movements, circling, almost as if it were studying its surroundings. It was as if the creature, whatever it was learning. And the longer it stayed within the confines of the base, the more intelligent its movements became. "We're dealing with something far beyond anything we were prepared for," Julia said, her voice barely a whisper. "And it's not alone." Dr. Harper's heart skipped a beat. What do you mean?" Julia stepped forward, pointing at the readings. "It's been sending out signals we haven't been able to decode, but now I think it's trying to communicate. And the worst part? It's targeting our communication systems." Dr. Harper looked at the screens, her mind racing. They were in a race against time, trying to figure out what this entity wanted, why it was here, and what it was capable of. Every second they delayed increased the danger. And yet, there was no way to predict its next move. The base had been designed to hold the most dangerous and secretive entities on the planet. But this was something different, something far more powerful and elusive. "This is beyond any containment procedure we've used before," Dr. Harper said, her voice steady but tinged with fear. "We need to act now. If it gets out of control—" Her words were cut off by a sudden burst of static that filled the room. The monitors flickered, and the entity's movements on the screen became erratic, shifting wildly, as if it had suddenly become aware of their presence. "It knows we're watching it," Paul said, his voice tense. "It's reacting to us." A chill ran down Dr. Harper's spine. Whatever this was, it wasn't just an anomaly. It was alive, and it was aware. "We have to shut it down before it escapes," Dr. Harper said, her voice filled with urgency. "Now." But as they scrambled to take action, the screens flickered one final time, and the room fell silent. On the main monitor, a single word flashed across the screen in bold red letters: "Freedom." And in that instant, they knew it was no longer a question of containment. The entity had already made its move. Dr. Harper's heart pounded in her chest as she watched the word "freedom" flash on the screen. It wasn't a message from the entity. It was a declaration. The entity had made its intentions clear. It wasn't just trying to survive. It was trying to escape. The room was silent, each member of the team processing the magnitude of what they were facing. The countdown had already begun. The last 30 minutes felt like an eternity. Their protocols had failed. Their equipment couldn't contain this entity, and it had realized it. "We've lost control," Paul said, his voice low, a mixture of disbelief and fear creeping into his words. "It's out of our hands." Dr. Harper clenched her fists, fighting the panic that was rising within her. She knew what was at stake. The entity had escaped from its containment field, and now the clock was ticking. They had no idea what it was capable of, how far it could spread, or if it was already active beyond the base. The most terrifying part was that they didn't even know what it was, how it had come to be, or why it had remained hidden for so long. "We need to lock down the facility, Doctor," Harper said, her voice barely above a whisper, filled with urgency. "Now, we need to isolate it before it's too late." "We don't even know where it is," Julia interjected, her face pale. "It could be anywhere. It could be inside the walls, in the air vents. Hell, it could be outside, already halfway to the surface." Dr. Harper's mind raced. There had to be something they were missing. They had failed to recognize the patterns in its behavior, the way it had been testing its boundaries. It hadn't been trying to break free immediately. It had been assessing, learning their methods, waiting for the right moment. And now, it had chosen to act. Shut down the primary access points, Dr. Harper ordered. Initiate lockdown. We need to trap it in one section of the facility and isolate the core systems. Don't give it access to anything it can use. As her team scrambled to follow her orders, Dr. Harper's thoughts kept returning to one question. What was it? The entity was unlike anything they had encountered. It didn't behave like a creature. It didn't act like anything biological. It was intelligence, a sentient force that could manipulate its surroundings, bend systems to its will. It wasn't just an alien being. It was something else, something far more terrifying. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and the room went dark for a split second before coming back to life. The monitors showed nothing but static for a moment. When the image cleared, Dr. Harper's blood ran cold. The entity had already infiltrated the facility's mainframe. They've breached the system, Paul said in horror. His fingers flew over the keyboard, trying to regain control. It's already inside the base network. Dr. Harper looked at the screen, a mix of panic and disbelief gripping her chest. The entity wasn't just a physical threat. It had become a digital one as well. It could manipulate the base's systems, control its power, its surveillance, and now its weapons. It wasn't confined to one area anymore. It was everywhere. It had become a part of the base itself. Shut it down! Lock it out! Now! Dr. Harper shouted, her voice cracking with urgency. Before it uses everything against us. But as they scrambled to regain control, the monitors flickered once more, and for a brief moment, Dr. Harper saw something that made her blood run even colder. A series of symbols flashed across the screen. Symbols she couldn't comprehend, but that she knew instinctively meant one thing. The entity was evolving. It was adapting, learning faster than they could stop it. And it wasn't just trying to escape anymore. It was preparing to conquer. The air in the control room was thick with tension. The sound of rapid typing at frantic commands filled the space as Dr. Harper and her team scrambled to regain control. The transmission from the entity had sent shock waves through their systems, but now the clock was ticking. The countdown had started, and each second that passed felt like an eternity. The entity had made its move, and there was no turning back. "We need to contain it," Dr. Harper said, her voice steady despite the rising panic inside her. "If it's already breached the system, we need to act fast. We can't let it spread." Paul was already working feverishly at his console, his face illuminated by the glow of the screens. "It's already inside. The systems are compromised. We don't know how deep it's integrated itself into the base." "We'll isolate it," Dr. Harper said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "We'll lock it in one section of the facility, but we need to get to the central core and shut down all external access points first." Julia nodded, but her face was pale, her hands shaking as she worked to send out the necessary commands. What if it's already made its way into the mainframe? What if it's too late to stop it? Dr. Harper didn't answer immediately. She didn't know if it was too late. They had underestimated the entity's capabilities before. But there was one thing they knew for sure. It wasn't just a threat anymore. It was something more than they had ever imagined. The entity wasn't simply trying to escape. It was trying to take control, to break free from its confinement, and it had already started to manipulate the systems around it. "I think it's already moved beyond containment," Dr. Harper finally said, her voice low. "We need to get to the heart of the base and take it down from there." Ben's voice broke through the tension. "What if it's too powerful? What if it's already learning too quickly for us to catch up?" "We don't have the luxury of doubt," Dr. Harper said firmly. "We have to try. We can't let it escape. We can't let it learn how to operate everything here. As the team continued to work, Dr. Harper's mind raced with possibilities. She was certain that the entity had learned everything it needed to escape long before it had made its move. It had been testing the boundaries, evaluating their security systems, and now it was too late. It was free, and they had to stop it before it could do anything irreversible. A new alarm blared, breaking her train of thought. The room went dark again, the emergency lights flickering to life. Dr. Harper turned to the screen, her breath caught in her throat. The transmission had changed again. This time, there was no message, only a single flickering image, a symbol. It was the shape of an open door. The symbol flickered once more, and then it was gone. Dr. Harper's heart skipped a beat. The entity was no longer just trying to escape. It was telling them something. The door was open. It was an invitation, a challenge. We have to make a decision, Dr. Harper said, her voice trembling despite her efforts to remain calm. We either shut it down now, or we let it continue to evolve. We don't know what's waiting on the other side. There was no turning back now. The team had to move forward, but the stakes were higher than they could have ever imagined. The entity wasn't just trying to escape. It was already planning its next move. Dr. Harper's heart raced as she watched the screen, where the symbol of the open door had vanished, replaced by a series of flashing, chaotic patterns. The room was silent, the weight of their predicament hanging over them like a storm cloud. Every part of her brain screamed for them to take immediate action, but the data they were seeing was unlike anything she had ever encountered. We've triggered something, Paul said, his voice laced with concern. He stood across the room, staring at his console, his face pale under the fluorescent lights. It's not just using the systems, it's rewriting them. Dr. Harper's hands shook slightly as she typed commands into the console, trying to force control back into their hands. She had read all the protocols, studied all the theories, but nothing had prepared her for this. They had underestimated the entity's capabilities, and now they were paying the price. We need to stop it now, Julia said, her voice strained, her eyes wide with fear. If it keeps going like this, it could take over the entire base. It could reach the surface. Dr. Harper's stomach twisted at the thought. They had always assumed the entity was contained, that they could maintain a secure perimeter. But now, it was clear. The entity had adapted to their systems. It had become a part of the base, and it was growing stronger with every passing second. The containment protocols are no longer enough, Dr. Harper said, her voice tight with fear. We need to cut off all external communication, lock the facility down completely. Ben's hands flew over the keyboard as he worked to isolate the system from any outside networks. I've cut off communications, but it's still in here. It's not just in the system. It's in the walls, in the air. The lights flickered again, and the temperature in the room dropped sharply. Dr. Harper could feel it too, the oppressive weight of the air around them. It was as if the very space they were in was reacting to the entity's presence, bending under its influence. We're too late, Paul said, his voice low and defeated. It's already in the infrastructure. It's not just a force anymore. It's alive. It's using everything. Dr. Harper felt a cold shiver run down her spine. The entity was no longer something they could control. It wasn't a computer program or a mechanical failure. It was a sentient force, alive and aware. It had learned from its containment. It had adapted, and now it was free. We need to get to the core systems, Dr. Harper said, her voice filled with urgency. We need to shut it down before it gets any further. But even as she said the words, she knew the truth. It was already too late. The entity wasn't just contained in the facility anymore. It had breached every wall, every system. The very core of the base was at its mercy. "We're not in control anymore," Dr. Harper muttered under her breath. "It's controlling us." A sudden burst of static interrupted the silence. The screen flashed again, this time with a message. The words were simple but chilling. "You cannot stop me." The entity had spoken, and with that, Dr. Harper knew they had crossed a line from which there was no return. The temperature in the room had dropped even further. Dr. Harper could feel the chill creeping up her spine, the air growing dense as the atmosphere around them seemed to shift. Every corner of the facility now felt suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. They weren't just dealing with a creature or a virus. They were facing something that had grown far beyond their understanding. "It's evolving," Paul said, his voice trembling. He stood at the console, fingers running frantically over the keyboard, trying to regain control of the failing systems. The systems, they're changing faster than we can process them. The monitors flickered, and a chilling series of distorted images flashed on the screen. It wasn't just data anymore. It was a pattern, a visual representation of something far more intelligent than anything they had ever encountered. It was learning, adapting. It had become a dynamic force, and it wasn't just inside the base anymore. It was part of it. The facility had become a living organism, connected and controlled by the entity's will. "Doctor," Harper's breath caught in her throat. "It's manipulating everything, the entire infrastructure. It's rewriting itself." The walls hummed with an unnatural energy, the sound filling the room like a low, constant vibration that seemed to resonate in her chest. She could feel it in her bones. The entity was using the base's systems like a puppet master, controlling every aspect of their environment. The isolation protocols were useless. The facility had become its domain. "It's in the air vents," Julia whispered, her voice faint. "It's in the air. It's in everything." Dr. Harper turned sharply to face her. Julia's words were like a slap to the face, a terrifying truth that she couldn't deny. They had underestimated the entity. They thought they could contain it, control it, but now it was too late. It had already become part of their world. "We need to isolate the core," Dr. Harper said, her voice steady, but filled with a growing sense of dread. "If we don't stop it now, it'll reach the surface. It'll break free." Ben's eyes were wide, his face pale. "We can't just shut it down. It's too embedded now. If we disconnect it from the system, it could retaliate. We could be opening the floodgates." The team was silent, staring at the screens, their faces drawn with the weight of their situation. The entity wasn't just a presence in their world. It had become their world. It had woven itself into the very fabric of the facility, and now it was expanding. "We can't just wait here," Dr. Harper said, her voice barely audible, the fear creeping into her words. "It's already learning from us. It knows how to survive. We need to act now, or we'll be consumed by it." As if in response to her words, the lights flickered again, this time with a violent intensity. The screens went black for a moment, before returning to life, but the message displayed wasn't something they expected to see. It wasn't a malfunction or static. It was a new pattern, a symbol, ancient and cryptic, but unmistakable. The screen displayed, "I am the horizon." Dr. Harper's stomach churned. The entity wasn't just a threat, it was becoming something far worse. It had evolved into a being that transcended the facility, and now it was preparing to stretch beyond the walls. They had no idea what was waiting for them outside. "We need to stop it, before it's too late," Dr. Harper said, her voice now filled with desperate urgency. But as they scrambled to come up with a solution, one undeniable truth hung in the air. The entity had already won. The facility had become a labyrinth of fear and uncertainty. Dr. Harper paced in the control room, her mind racing as the full scope of the disaster took hold. The entity had breached every containment measure, transforming from an unseen presence into a tangible force. No corner of the base was safe anymore. The once secure walls now seemed to close in on them, trapping them in a nightmare. "It's everywhere," Julia whispered, her eyes glued to the monitors. "The systems, the power grids fluctuating. The doors won't respond anymore." Dr. Harper stared at the flickering screens, a sense of dread seizing her chest. The entity wasn't just controlling systems, it was reshaping them. It had infiltrated the very core of the facility, overriding security protocols, manipulating every piece of technology. The building itself was now a tool in its hands. "It's feeding off the power grid," Paul said, his voice tinged with disbelief. "It's growing stronger. It's adapting to the facility." "We need to cut it off," Dr. Harper said, her voice hard but uncertain. "We need to isolate the core and block its access to everything. If it gets to the surface, it's over." But even as she spoke, Dr. Harper knew it was too late. The entity had surpassed their ability to contain it. It wasn't just inside the walls anymore. It was part of the very systems that ran the base. It had taken control of the communications network, sealing off any chance of external help. The isolation they'd hoped for was slipping away, leaving them stranded with something they barely understood. The walls trembled, vibrating as a low hum resonated throughout the facility. It was as though the building itself was alive, infused with the entity's energy. Dr. Harper could feel the oppressive presence in every corner of the room. It was getting stronger, more present, and terrifyingly more intelligent. "We can't stay here," Ben said, his face drawn with fear as he scanned the malfunctioning systems. "We need to get out. Now." The idea of escape seemed impossible. The entity had consumed the base. There were no more safe routes. The walls were its walls, the doors were its doors, and every space was a potential trap. The escape routes were gone, swallowed by the entity's insidious control. "We can't run from this," Dr. Harper replied, her voice growing firm with resolve. "We've been chosen to stop it. We have to face it, no matter what it is." Suddenly, the lights flickered and went out, plunging the room into darkness. A pulse of deep, unnatural light emerged from the depths of the facility, its rhythm almost alive, like the entity's heartbeat. It was as though the entity had become a living, breathing presence, feeding on the fear it was generating. "We're running out of time," Julia said, her voice shaking. "If we don't act now, we'll be trapped here forever." Dr. Harper gripped the edge of the control table, her mind a whirl of chaos. What was this thing? It wasn't just a creature or an alien. It was something else entirely. It was a sentient intelligence capable of manipulating its environment, evolving faster than they could comprehend. It had become part of the very infrastructure of the facility. The team was fighting something that had transcended biology, science, and technology. The control room door slammed shut with a deafening bang. They were trapped. "This is it," Dr. Harper said, her voice laced with urgency. "We have to go in. We don't have much time." As the final stage began, Dr. Harper knew one thing for certain. Whatever was waiting for them beyond that door, they weren't just fighting for their lives anymore. They were fighting for the survival of everything. The door to the control room slammed shut with a deafening noise, trapping the team inside. The emergency lockdown protocol had been activated, sealing off all exits. They had no choice but to move forward. The entity had cornered them. The weight of their decision pressed on Dr. Harper's chest. There was no turning back now. The room was bathed in an eerie, pulsating light emanating from the screens. The walls trembled again, vibrating with a deep, ominous hum that seemed to shake the very air around them. It wasn't just the building that felt alive anymore. The entity was now part of everything, part of them. And that realization made Dr. Harper's blood run cold. "We need to move," Ben said, his voice trembling but resolute. "Now, stay close, stay focused," Dr. Harper commanded, her tone steely. Despite the terror clawing at her insides, she wasn't sure how they would face what was coming, but they had no other option. They had to take the fight to the heart of the entity, or risk losing everything. The team made their way down the dark, narrow corridor that led deeper into the facility. The lights above flickered sporadically, casting long, eerie shadows across the walls. The hum of the facility grew louder, as though the entire base was resonating with the entity's energy. "It's everywhere," Julia whispered, her voice a mixture of fear and awe. "This isn't just a building anymore. It's alive." Dr. Harper nodded, her mind racing. The entity had infected every part of the base, from the walls to the wiring. It had integrated itself with the facility, making it its own. And now they were walking into its heart, where it all began. As they moved further, the walls seemed to close in around them. The air felt thicker, heavier, almost suffocating. A team reached the entrance to the core of the facility, the room that housed the entity's containment. Once there, they would have to find a way to cut it off, to destroy it before it could escape. "We're almost there," Dr. Harper said, her voice barely a whisper. "Keep your heads down and stay alert." But as they reached the entrance, the door before them hissed open by itself, revealing the heart of the facility. The room was massive, its walls lined with intricate machinery, pulsating with a strange energy. At the center, the containment chamber flickered, its glowing lights dimming and brightening erratically. Something was wrong. The entity had already begun to manipulate the core systems, threatening to break free once again. "There it is," Paul murmured, his eyes widening in horror. Before them, the entity was no longer a mere presence. It had taken form, a swirling mass of dark energy, shifting and undulating like smoke, but alive, sentient and aware. It was drawing power from the core, feeding off the facility's energy like a parasite, and now it was turning toward them. "We have to stop it," Julia screamed, her voice a mix of desperation and fear. Dr. Harper's heart raced. They were standing in front of the thing they had been trying to contain for so long. It was more powerful than they could have imagined. It wasn't just trying to escape anymore. It was ready to consume everything. "Get ready," Dr. Harper said, her voice steady despite the overwhelming fear coursing through her. "This is it. We end it here." And with that, the team prepared to face the force they had unleashed. The fate of the world hung in the balance. The room seemed to vibrate with an unnatural energy as the entity loomed before them. Dr. Harper's heart raced in her chest as she stood at the threshold of the containment chamber. The air was thick with tension, the pulse of the facility matching the growing resonance of the entity's power. This wasn't just a being of alien origin anymore. It had become something far more, something beyond comprehension. The walls around them seemed to bend and shift, warping with the entity's presence, as if the very fabric of reality was starting to unravel. "We have to act now," Dr. Harper said, her voice steady, though every part of her screamed in panic. "We can't let it breach the core systems." "It's too strong," Ben replied, his voice filled with a quiet desperation. "We can't stop it." Julia, her hands shaking, reached for a weapon, though it was unclear what could even stop something like this. They had no answers, only an overwhelming sense of dread. This was their last chance to shut down the entity. If they failed, there would be no world left to fight for. "Get the containment systems online," Dr. Harper commanded. "We need to isolate it before it can break free. Lock down everything." As Ben and Paul scrambled to activate the core containment protocols, the entity's mass seemed to expand, stretching out in eerie, tendril-like shapes, writhing through the chamber, feeding off the energy around it. The lights flickered once more, casting long, jagged shadows across the room. "It's adapting," Paul shouted. "It's learning from us, from everything we do." The realization hit Dr. Harper like a bolt of lightning. This entity wasn't just intelligent, it was evolving, changing in response to their every move. They had underestimated its ability to manipulate not just the physical world, but the very technology that they depended on. It wasn't just trying to escape, it was playing with them. "Shut down the power to the containment chamber," Dr. Harper yelled. "It has control over the systems now. We need to cut it off." But before they could act, the entity's presence seemed to intensify, coiling around them. The temperature in the room plummeted, and a freezing chill swept through the air. It was as if the creature's mind was reaching out, touching them, assessing them. A low hum filled the room, vibrating through their bodies. The entity wasn't just watching anymore. It was probing them, testing them. "I can't get the system to respond," Ben shouted in frustration. "It's overriding everything we do." Dr. Harper looked at the entity, feeling its gaze, if it could even be called that. It was all-encompassing, like an intelligence far beyond their own. The walls around them felt as though they were closing in, every inch of the facility slowly bending to the entity's will. "We're running out of time," Julius said, his voice strained. "We're trapped. What do we do now?" There was no more time for hesitation. They had no backup, no reinforcements coming. This was it. They had opened Pandora's box, and now they had to face the consequences. "We fight," Dr. Harper said, her voice hardening with resolve. "We fight it with everything we have." As the final confrontation loomed, the room filled with the terrifying realization that they weren't just battling for survival. They were fighting to prevent the end of everything they knew. The entity wasn't just a threat to the facility anymore. It was a threat to the world, and it was up to them to stop it, before it was too late. The room shook as the entity's power surged, its presence seeping into every corner of the facility. Dr. Harper could feel it, its weight, its pulse, almost like the heart of the building itself was beating in sync with the creature's insidious energy. The air was thick with static, the walls vibrating in ways that defied explanation. They were running out of time. The countdown was already ticking, and with every second that passed, the entity's influence grew stronger. "We have to stop it now," Dr. Harper said, her voice barely above a whisper. She was at the center of the command hub, her fingers hovering over the control panel. Every part of her being screamed to act. But what could they possibly do against something this powerful? They had no weapons, no means to fight it physically. But they had one last chance, a last desperate measure. "Dr. Harper, the entity is using the power grid," Paul shouted from his station. "It's draining everything, gaining control over everything. Systems, weapons, even the air filtration. If we don't shut it down, we'll lose it all." Dr. Harper's mind raced. They had to sever its connection to the facility's systems. If they didn't, the entity would have total control over everything. And if it broke free, if it reached the outside world, there would be no stopping it. They had to isolate it before it was too late. "Ben, initiate manual shutdown," Dr. Harper ordered, her voice strong despite the rising panic. "Cut the power to the entire base." Ben's hands moved swiftly across the console, inputting commands, his face taut with concentration. The tension in the room was suffocating. Dr. Harper could feel her pulse quicken as the minutes slipped away. The humming noise, the one that had been a constant in the facility for so long, grew louder, deeper. The entity was fighting back, resisting the shutdown. The lights flickered again, this time for much longer. And then, everything went dark. For a moment, there was nothing but silence. Dr. Harper held her breath. Could they have done it? Had they finally severed the entity's hold over the base? But then the screens flickered back to life, dim and distorted. The control panel was unresponsive. The entity was no longer just manipulating the systems. We've awakened it, Julia whispered, her voice shaking. It's not just trying to escape. It's using us. It's using our own technology. Dr. Harper's eyes darted between the flickering screens. The entity wasn't just manipulating the facility. It was using the teens' own actions against them, its intelligence adapting faster than they could react. Every command they issued, every shutdown attempt, only seemed to empower it more. "We can't let it win," Dr. Harper said, her voice full of determination. "We have to finish what we started. We can't stop now." With renewed resolve, Dr. Harper turned back to the console. She had one last chance, a final sequence to isolate the core. It was a long shot, but it was their only shot. As she typed in the final commands, the facility trembled once more. The entity's pulse surged, vibrating through the walls like a death rattle. It wasn't just fighting them anymore. It was trying to pull them under, trying to drag them into the very abyss it had emerged from. But Dr. Harper knew one thing for certain. They couldn't give up now. This was the final battle, the last stand against something they couldn't possibly understand. And if they lost, everything would be over. "Come on," she muttered, her fingers trembling as they danced across the keyboard. "We have to do this, for all of us." The countdown was almost over. The facility was eerily quiet, but the tension in the air was suffocating. Dr. Harper could feel the entity's presence surrounding them, a growing sense of urgency that pressed on her chest with each passing moment. The dark, pulsating glow from the malfunctioning monitors cast long shadows on the walls, heightening the already unbearable atmosphere. They had reached a point of no return. What they did next would either save them or doom them all. The screens flickered once more, now showing garbled images and distorted symbols. The entity was no longer just an intelligent force confined to the walls. It was everywhere, embedded in the systems, in the air they breathed, and within every corner of the base. It had learned to adapt to their every move, outwitting them at every turn. The last bit of control was slipping from their hands. "We can't keep doing this," Julia said, her voice strained, barely audible over the hum of the malfunctioning equipment. "It's not going to stop. We've given it everything, and it's still—" Her voice faltered, filled with both disbelief and fear. "We have one option left," Dr. Harper said, turning to face the team. Her voice was steady, but the weight of the situation threatened to break her. "We either stop it now, or we let it take over everything." Paul, who had been silent for most of the encounter, finally spoke up, his voice filled with dread. "What do you mean, stop it? It's inside the systems. It's using our technology against us. It's evolving faster than we can even think. How do we stop something like that?" Dr. Harper's mind raced, but she kept her composure. The facility had been compromised. Their only hope now lay in the core systems. The entity had grown too powerful, too entrenched. They had only one option left. Isolate the core, cut off the entity's access to the systems completely. But the risk was immense. No one knew what would happen if they pulled the plug entirely. The entity had already shown it could survive on its own, and isolating it might make it more dangerous. But if they didn't act now, they'd lose everything. Their only chance at survival was to sever the connection. "This is it," Dr. Harper said quietly, looking at the rest of the team. We initiate the final shutdown sequence. No matter what happens, we have to sever its connection to the facility. Ben hesitated for a moment, looking at the flickering monitors with wide eyes. What if this makes it worse? What if it gets out of the facility and spreads? We don't have a choice, Dr. Harper said, her voice resolute. If we don't do this, we'll lose everything. There's no turning back once we initiate this sequence. A deafening silence fell over the room as the team exchanged looks of uncertainty. The countdown to shutdown had already begun, and they were rapidly running out of time. Every second felt like an eternity. Dr. Harper pressed the button. The command was simple, but the implications were vast. It was the last thing they could do. The room seemed to hold its breath, the hum of the monitors fading into a tense silence. For a long moment, nothing happened. But then, the lights flickered. The ground beneath them trembled. The monitors displayed strange symbols, flashing at a frantic pace. The shutdown sequence had begun. But was it enough? The real battle was just beginning. The entity wasn't going down without a fight. The room trembled, the lights flickering violently as the shutdown sequence continued to unfold. Dr. Harper's hands gripped the console, her knuckles white as she watched the symbols on the screen flash faster. The feedback from the entity growing more chaotic by the second. The walls seemed to pulse with the entity's energy, as if the building itself were alive and fighting against the shutdown. The deeper they went, the stronger the resistance. We've initiated the sequence. It's too late to stop now, Dr. Harper said, her voice shaking as she focused on the rapidly changing data. The atmosphere was charged, thick with a tension so palpable it almost felt like the walls were pressing in. This is it. We're at the point of no return. Julia stood nearby, her eyes wide with fear, but a flicker of determination in her gaze. What if we can't hold it? What if it breaks through? Dr. Harper's gaze locked onto the screen, watching as the symbols began to distort, warping in ways they couldn't even comprehend. The entity was fighting back. They weren't just trying to stop it anymore. They were waging war with something that could think, evolve, and adapt faster than any of them could anticipate. The energy levels were off the charts now, and every second felt like it could be their last. Keep pushing forward, Dr. Harper said, her voice growing more urgent. We can't afford to hesitate. This is our only shot. But as she spoke, the systems began to fail one by one. The console started to blink erratically, warning lights flashing across the room. The air grew heavier, a strange humming filling the space as the walls seemed to grow closer. They were losing control. The screens began to glitch, showing eerie, distorted images that flashed in rapid succession, some kind of digital projection, but warped, like the entity was trying to force its presence into their perception. It was pushing against their boundaries, using the very fabric of the system to expand beyond their control. It's breaking through, Paul shouted, his hands flying over his station as he tried desperately to regain control. The system is collapsing. We can't stop it. The room was filled with the sound of alarms, the lights flickering more rapidly as the walls continued to vibrate. The entity had gone beyond the physical systems. It had become part of their consciousness, part of the building, part of their minds. They weren't just fighting to regain control of the system anymore. They were fighting for their survival. We need to seal it off. Now! Dr. Harper barked, the urgency in her voice making it clear that they were running out of time. Lock down all access points. We can't let it out. But as she said the words, a new, terrifying realization hit her like a wave. The entity wasn't trying to escape anymore. It was evolving, learning at a speed they couldn't keep up with. It was adapting to every attempt to isolate it, using its surroundings, its environment, to grow stronger. "We're too late," Ben said, his voice barely above a whisper, filled with a grim resignation. "It's already too strong. There's nothing we can do." Dr. Harper clenched her jaw, the weight of the situation crashing down on her. They had crossed a line they couldn't uncross, and as the shutdown failed and the screens continued to warp and flicker, one final truth became painfully clear. The entity had already won. The final confrontation had begun, and there was no telling how it would end. Dr. Harper's heart raced as she watched the screens flicker and distort. The entity was no longer just an intruder. It had become part of the very system they had once trusted. Every failed attempt to shut it down had only made it stronger, more entrenched. The countdown was nearing its end, and there was no way of knowing if they had done enough. The control room was in chaos. The flickering lights added to the sense of impending doom, their constant buzzing growing louder in Dr. Harper's ears. Each second seemed to stretch into eternity. The hum in the air was no longer just a sound. It felt like an oppressive force, wrapping itself around them, pressing them down. The walls were alive, pulsating in rhythm with the entity's expanding presence. "We're losing it," Paul said, his voice tight with panic as he typed frantically. "We've lost control of the systems. We're running out of time." Dr. Harper's fingers trembled over the console, unable to focus as the reality of the situation set in. The shutdown protocols had failed, and now the entity was no longer a mere anomaly. It had evolved into something more, something far more dangerous. It had escaped the confines of its digital prison and was spreading throughout the facility. "It's adapting," Dr. Harper muttered, the words barely leaving her lips. "It's learning from every move we make." Julia's face was pale, her eyes darting between the monitors, the chaos around them, and the clock ticking down. "Is there anything we can do now?" she asked, her voice breaking with the weight of the question. "We have one option left," Dr. Harper said, though she wasn't sure if it would work. She wasn't sure of anything anymore. "We can try to isolate the core systems manually, severing its connection to the building's network. If we can do that, we might be able to stop it." The air in the room grew colder as Dr. Harper's words settled in. They had already pushed every system to its limits. They had already run out of options. The entity was more than just a force. They had awakened something with intelligence, awareness, and an insatiable hunger to grow. The walls seemed to close in on them, and the power grid flickered one last time. The building was shaking as if it were alive, its heartbeat matching the pulsing energy in the air. It wasn't just the entity trying to break free. It had become the building, the system, the infrastructure itself. "We have seconds left," Ben said, his voice filled with dread as he looked at the flashing countdown. "We need to move fast." Dr. Harper's breath caught in her throat. She could feel the energy pulsing around her, and as she turned toward the final control switch, a cold wave of realization washed over her. They had waited too long. The entity had already become part of everything. She entered the final command with a shaky hand, the pressure building with each second. The countdown continued, and for a moment, the room went completely silent. The lights flickered one last time, and then the room went dark. The hum in the air stopped. Everything was still. And then, the final message appeared on the screen. "You cannot stop what you have started." The words burned into their minds as the true horror of their actions dawned on them. The entity had already won. The room was bathed in an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional hum of malfunctioning equipment. Dr. Harper stood frozen in front of the control panel, her eyes locked onto the screen. The message from the entity was clear now, ominous and undeniable. "You cannot stop what you have started." The words glowed on the screen in pulsating red letters, and Dr. Harper felt a cold sweat break out across her back. They had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. The entity had won, and now it was revealing itself in ways they could never have anticipated. "Is it over?" Julia whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of fear and disbelief. "Has it taken over completely?" Dr. Harper didn't have an answer. The systems around them were in disarray, the building shaking as though it were being pulled apart. The hum in the air had intensified, vibrating through their bodies with a deep resonance that made their bones ache. The entity was no longer something contained within walls. It had become the very walls, the power grid, the very air around them. "I don't think it's over," Dr. Harper said, her voice barely audible. She couldn't tear her eyes away from the screen, watching as the symbols began to shift once more. They weren't just random. They were forming something much more sinister. The shapes on the screen twisted into a spiraling pattern, a vortex that seemed to draw the team's attention toward its center. As the symbols swirled and folded, they began to take shape, an enormous eye glowing with a sinister light. The eye blinked, and a ripple of energy surged through the facility, sending shockwaves through the walls. "We've awakened something," Paul said, his voice hoarse. "Something beyond our comprehension, and now it's staring right at us." The realization hit Dr. Harper like a physical blow. The entity wasn't just a program. It wasn't just a virus or a simple intelligence. It was conscious, aware, and it was watching them. The eye on the screen wasn't a symbol. It was the entity, observing them, studying them. They had become its subjects. "The core systems are going offline," Ben said in a strained voice, eyes wide as he frantically typed at his console. "It's taking control. We've lost the facility." Dr. Harper felt the weight of their helplessness crash down on her. There was no more fighting it. No more strategies. No more plans. The entity had surpassed their understanding. It had become too powerful, too intelligent to control. All their attempts to contain it had failed, and now they were at its mercy. The lights flickered again, casting the room in brief moments of complete darkness. Each time the lights came back on, the screen showed something new, an image of the facility, but distorted, twisted, as if the entity was warping the very reality they stood in. "We need to find a way out," Julia said, her voice breaking. "There's nothing left to fight. We're trapped." Dr. Harper turned to face the others. They had already lost. The entity wasn't just a threat. It had become their world. The reality they had known no longer existed. Everything they thought they understood had crumbled. And now they were at the mercy of something far beyond their comprehension. "There's no escape," Dr. Harper said softly, the weight of her words sinking in. "We can't run from this. It's too late." The eye on the screen blinked once more, and the hum in the air grew louder, almost deafening. The facility was no longer just a place. They were inside the entity. And as the screen faded to black, one final message appeared. "You're now part of me." The atmosphere in the control room was suffocating, thick with the realization that their fight was over. The lights flickered, casting long shadows against the walls, as the hum of the facility seemed to grow in volume. Dr. Harper's heart raced as she stared at the now blank screen. The eye that had previously watched them was gone. In its place was an overwhelming, creeping darkness, both in the room and in her mind. "We've failed," Paul muttered, his voice laced with defeat. "We were too late." Dr. Harper swallowed hard, the weight of his words hitting her harder than she expected. She knew it too. The entity had become something that transcended their understanding. The message it had left behind was final. "You are now part of me. The words echoed in her mind, haunting her, seeping into her thoughts like poison. "We can't just give up," Julia spoke up, her voice shaking but defiant. She had been with Dr. Harper through every step of this harrowing journey. "There has to be a way. There has to be something we can do." But what? Dr. Harper thought. What could they do now that the entity had fully integrated into the facility systems, into their very reality? The walls around them seemed to pulse with a malevolent energy, as if the entity itself had become part of their very surroundings. It wasn't just in the computers anymore, it was everywhere, in the air, in the walls, in the flickering lights. Dr. Harper turned toward the others, her gaze steady. "We still have one option left." Ben looked up from his console, his face pale, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. "What option? We're out of time. It controls everything. It can see everything." "I'm not talking about running," Dr. Harper replied, her voice firm, though she could feel the fear in the pit of her stomach. "I'm talking about accessing the core systems and trying to override it. We can still try to stop it." "But the entity has integrated itself into the systems," Paul said, shaking his head. "It's become one with the facility. How do we fight something like that?" Dr. Harper didn't have an answer. What they were dealing with now was unlike anything humanity had ever encountered. They had opened a door into the unknown, and now that door was closing fast, trapping them in a world they couldn't escape. The entity had become the very place they stood in, and they had no idea how to sever the connection. "We don't fight it," Dr. Harper said quietly, her voice filled with a resignation that made her feel older than she had just moments ago. "We survive it. We try to control what we can and hope it's enough." Julia reached over, placing her hand on Dr. Harper's shoulder. "We're with you." But Dr. Harper knew the truth. There was no easy way out, no quick fix. They had reached the precipice, and now all they could do was stand on the edge and wait for the inevitable. The monitors flickered to life again, but this time the symbols weren't shifting. They were solid, glaring at them like a final warning. The last thing Dr. Harper said, Harper saw before everything went dark, was the same eye, the eye that had haunted them since the beginning. But now it wasn't just an eye, it was a reflection of them all. The screen went black, and they were no longer alone. The room was silent. The only sound, the low hum of the facility's failing systems. Dr. Harper stood at the control panel, the glowing screen flickering weakly as the monitors buzzed with static. Her mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, trying to process everything that had happened. But there was no time for contemplation now. The entity had evolved past their understanding, and they were running out of options. Their last chance to stop it was slipping away with every second. "We're running out of time," Julia said, her voice trembling. "It's getting stronger. We can't just wait for it to finish us off." Dr. Harper nodded, her eyes glued to the screen. The symbols, once chaotic and evolving, had now settled into a pattern too perfect to be natural. They weren't just random shapes or symbols. They were a command, an instruction. The entity had reached the point where it no longer needed to hide or deceive. It was making its final move. "We need to sever the connection," Dr. Harper said, her voice steady, though her heart pounded in her chest. "We need to isolate the car systems. If we don't, it will be able to break free. It will be able to go beyond this base." "But how?" Paul asked, his eyes darting nervously between the screens. "It's integrated itself into everything. The core, the power grid, the surveillance. Everything's compromised. We can't just cut it off." "We have to," Dr. Harper said, her voice a little firmer. "The only way to stop it is to cut its access to the base's mainframe. We need to manually shut it down from the central server room." Ben stepped forward, his face pale and tight with fear. "But what if it's waiting for us? What if it knows we're coming?" Dr. Harper's mind raced. The idea of walking straight into the heart of the facility, into the entity's control center, was terrifying. But it was their only shot. They had come this far, and turning back now would be their demise. "We don't have a choice," Dr. Harper said, the weight of her decision sinking in. "We do it together. We go in. We make it count." The group stood frozen for a moment, but then, without a word, they began to gather their gear. They moved quickly, their footsteps muffled by the oppressive silence in the corridors. The entity's presence was everywhere, seeping into the very walls, watching them from every angle. Dr. Harper could feel it, a constant pressure in her chest, as though the walls themselves were closing in around her. As they approached the server room, the door slid open with a hiss, and they stepped inside. The room was dark, illuminated only by the faint glow of the monitors. But the symbols on the screens had changed. They were no longer just abstract patterns. They were eyes watching them, silent, waiting. Dr. Harper's breath caught in her throat. The entity had anticipated their move. "We're too late," she whispered. But she had no time to dwell on the thought. They were already inside. They had come this far. As the team moved to engage the system, the lights flickered one last time, and a low rumble shook the room. The entity was waking up, and this time it wasn't hiding anymore. It was coming for them. "Get to the core system," Dr. Harper commanded, her voice strained with urgency. "We need to sever its hold before it's too late." But as they moved to take action, the walls seemed to pulse, the air thick with tension. It was now or never. The entity was no longer a mystery. It was their enemy, and it was about to fight back in a way they couldn't even begin to comprehend. The final confrontation had begun. The room trembled as the low hum of the facility's machinery escalated into a deep, menacing vibration. Dr. Harper's pulse quickened as she watched the central system screen flicker wildly. The entity was awake. Its presence was no longer confined to the confines of the mainframe. It had spread, seeped into every inch of the facility, making it impossible to discern where the base ended and the entity began. It was as though the walls, the air, the very floor beneath their feet were all part of it now. "We're not alone anymore," Julia whispered, her voice shaking. "It's here, in this room, watching us." Dr. Harper's heart raced. She had known it would come to this, but the reality of it was worse than anything she could have imagined. The entity, whatever it was, had reached the point where it no longer had to hide. It was fully conscious, and it was aware of their every move. "We need to act now," Dr. Harper said, her voice barely audible, her eyes locked on the screen. "The core systems are our only chance. If we don't shut it down now, it will have complete control. The whole base will become its domain." Ben stepped forward, his face pale with fear. "But how do we stop it? How do we fight something that's already inside us?" Before Dr. Harper could answer, the lights above them flickered violently, casting eerie shadows across the room. A strange, low growl filled the air, like a distant rumble of thunder, but the walls weren't shaking from the outside world. This was something far worse, something from within the facility itself. The symbols on the screen pulsed again, now shifting faster, their patterns growing more complex. It was as if the entity was speaking to them, communicating in a language they couldn't understand. The room felt suffocating as the energy around them began to intensify. The entity was no longer just a digital presence. It had become something far more dangerous, an intelligence that could manipulate both the physical and virtual worlds. "We have to shut it off," Paul said, his voice frantic. "We're running out of time. It's too powerful." Dr. Harper shook her head. "We can't just shut it off. We need to sever its connection to the core systems. We have to disconnect it completely from the facility's power grid, or it will take control of everything. It's no longer just inside the walls. It's inside us." As they scrambled to follow her orders, the rumbling grew louder. The walls around them seemed to flex and bend, as if the very structure of the base was reacting to the entity's awakening. It wasn't just contained anymore. It was pushing, expanding, and searching for a way out. A sharp hiss cut through the room as a new symbol appeared on the screen. It was different from the others, darker, jagged, and seemingly more hostile. It pulsed with an aggressive energy, as if the entity was aware of their actions and trying to fight back. "It's fighting us," Julia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It knows we're trying to stop it." Dr. Harper felt a cold shiver run down her spine as she realized the truth. They were no longer dealing with a foreign presence. The entity had evolved beyond its original form. It wasn't just trying to survive anymore. It was trying to conquer. "We need to hurry," Dr. Harper said, her voice firm with determination. "We've crossed a line. We can't go back now." As the team worked frantically to initiate the shutdown procedure, the energy in the room reached a fever pitch. The entity wasn't just reacting to them. It was fighting for its freedom. And the more they tried to contain it, the more determined it became to break free. The final confrontation had arrived, and Dr. Harper knew that nothing would be the same again. The air in the room felt thick, as though it was no longer just air, but something heavier, charged with an unrelenting energy. The monitors flashed erratically, and the low hum of the facility now vibrated through the walls like a warning. Dr. Harper stood motionless, her mind racing as she watched the screen. The entity, now fully awake and active, had crossed the point of no return. It was no longer something they could contain. It had become something far more dangerous. And it was evolving faster than they could comprehend. "We've underestimated it," Paul said, his voice shaking with the weight of the truth. "It's too smart, too powerful." Dr. Harper didn't answer at first. There were no words left. She knew Paul was right. The entity wasn't just a virus or a malfunctioning program. It had evolved into something sentient, something that could adapt, learn, and fight back. They had unknowingly unleashed a force beyond their control. The symbols on the screen began to change again, this time growing more chaotic, more erratic. The walls seemed to respond to the shifting patterns, vibrating as if they were alive, pulsing with the entity's energy. It was as though the facility itself was transforming into a living, breathing organism, one that was feeding off the chaos. "We need to stop it, now," Julia said, her voice tense, eyes wide with fear. "It's too late to contain it. It's too strong." Harper's fingers hovered over the console, hesitant. The controls were all locked down, and the system was fighting them at every turn. The entity had taken full control. Every part of the facility was now under its influence. "We have no choice," Dr. Harper said, her voice grim. "We can't run. We can't hide. We have to face it head on. We're the only ones left who can stop it." The ground beneath them began to shake, and the lights flickered again. But this time, they didn't flicker in the usual way. There was something unnatural about it, like the very foundation of the base was trembling in fear. It wasn't just a malfunction. This was the entity, making its move, ready to break free. "We're running out of time," Ben said, his voice barely audible, as though speaking too loud would break the fragile silence. "It's moving. It's getting closer." The symbols on the screen began to morph and twist, faster than before. They were no longer just abstract patterns. They had become something else, something much more sinister. The walls around them seemed to close in, the weight of the entity's presence pushing down on them, making it harder to breathe. "This is it," Dr. Harper whispered, her eyes glued to the screen. "We either stop it now or we lose everything." The final confrontation was upon them. The entity was no longer just a presence in the base. It was an active, growing force, and if they didn't act quickly, it would escape, unleashing its full potential. They had no idea what it was capable of, but they knew one thing. It wasn't just a threat to the facility, it was a threat to everything. "We have one shot." Dr. Harper said, her voice trembling with the weight of their responsibility. "We have to shut it down, now." As the countdown began, the team worked frantically, their hands moving with a sense of urgency they hadn't felt before. The entity's grip on the base tightened with each passing second. But they still had hope, however slim. The fate of everything rested on one final decision. The sound of the countdown was deafening, echoing in the control room as Dr. Harper watched the monitors flicker with a sense of dread. Time had run out. There was no turning back now. The entity they had been trying to contain, the force they had so blindly unleashed, was no longer just a presence. It had become something much more. Something alive, something sentient. "This is it," Julia said, her voice barely audible, filled with terror. "It's happening." Dr. Harper stood frozen, her eyes fixed on the screen as the final countdown ticked away. The walls around them vibrated again, this time with a sense of finality. The air was thick, oppressive, as though the very atmosphere was charged with energy that didn't belong to this world. The facility, once a secure place, had turned into a living nightmare, pulsating with the essence of the entity. On the screen, the symbols that had once been cryptic began to shift and change once more. But this time, they weren't just symbols. They had become images, visions of the entity itself. Its form, still hidden in the deepest corners of the base, seemed to manifest in digital shapes, shifting, growing, swirling with a malevolent energy. It was as if it was watching them, its presence growing stronger with every passing second. It's adapting," Ben said, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's evolving faster than we can stop it." Dr. Harper's heart raced. The base's systems, the ones they had once trusted, were now turning against them. The very walls, the very foundation of the facility, seemed to bend and twist, like they were made of something other than steel and concrete. The entity was becoming part of everything. It had infiltrated their control systems, their power grid, and now it was inside their minds. The screen flashed again, and for a moment, everything went dark. Silence filled the room, an eerie, suffocating silence that pressed against their ears. The lights flickered and came back on, but when the image cleared, the screen displayed something they hadn't expected. The entity's form was no longer just an image. It was reaching out, pulling at them, communicating in ways that were impossible to ignore. It was no longer just manipulating the facility. It was trying to merge with them, to control their thoughts, their emotions. It's inside us," Julia gasped, her eyes wide with terror. "It's taking over." The air around them felt colder, the temperature dropping rapidly as the entity's presence grew stronger. The hum of the machinery, once a comforting sound, now felt like an ominous warning, a ticking clock counting down to their inevitable fate. "We have to finish this," Dr. Harper said, her voice trembling but resolute. "We can't let it take over. We have to stop it, now." Her fingers flew over the console, inputting commands at lightning speed. But the more she tried to fight it, the more the entity seemed to fight back, adapting, learning from their every move. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in, the pressure mounting with every second that passed. As the final moments approached, Dr. Harper said. Harper knew one thing for sure. Whatever happened next, nothing would ever be the same again. They were no longer just fighting to survive. They were fighting for their very existence. The entity had awoken, and it was determined to consume everything in its path. The question was, would they be able to stop it before it was too late? The control room was plunged into darkness, save for the flickering light of the monitors that now displayed an image far more terrifying than anything they had faced before. The entity, no longer just an anomaly, had taken its final form. Its presence was now manifest in every corner of the facility, and it was relentless. Its energy filled the room, a suffocating force that seemed to twist the air around them. "We've reached the end," Dr. Harper muttered under her breath, staring at the screen as her pulse quickened. The entity was no longer hiding behind cryptic symbols or malfunctions in the system. It had become fully tangible, taking shape as a terrifying force of nature, something they couldn't control. It was no longer a mystery they could solve. It was a nightmare they were living. The lights flickered back on, revealing the haunting reality of the situation. The walls seemed to pulse with life, the floor vibrating beneath them. The screens now displayed an image of the entity, not in the abstract, but in its true form. Massive, sprawling and alive, spreading throughout the facility. There was no escape from it now. No physical barricade could stop it. "What are we supposed to do?" Julia's voice was trembling, filled with panic. "It's everywhere. It's inside everything." Dr. Harper stood frozen, her mind racing. The entity was no longer just an intruder. It had merged with the very fabric of their world. It wasn't confined to the digital networks or the physical walls of the base. It was in the air they breathed, in the power systems, in every fiber of the building. It had claimed everything. "We fight," Dr. Harper said, her voice firm despite the fear coursing through her veins. "We fight until the end." Ben and Paul nodded, their faces etched with determination, but their eyes revealed the terror they were all feeling. There was no more time for hesitation. The final confrontation had begun, and there was no turning back. The entity's presence intensified, a pulsating energy that surged through the walls, the lights flickering again as it tried to overwhelm them. The power systems groaned under the pressure, and the base's core systems began to shut down one by one. They were running out of time. The entity was suffocating them, drawing on every available resource to strengthen itself. "We need to disable the core," Dr. Harper said, her voice calm but urgent. "We need to disconnect it from everything, cut off its power source." With trembling hands, they input the last command, praying it would work. The countdown on the mainframe screen was ticking down faster than ever. They had one last chance, but the weight of the decision was almost too much to bear. They didn't know if this final action would stop the entity or if it would make things worse. Just as the countdown hit 0, the room shook with an explosion of energy, blinding light pouring from the screen. And then for a split second, silence. The entity had reacted. Had they succeeded? Or was this just the beginning of a far darker chapter? Dr. Harper held her breath, staring at the now still screen. The future hung in the balance, the fate of humanity in the unknown hands of whatever force had been unleashed. One thing was certain: nothing would ever be the same again.